Scotland has been in turmoil for the last 8 years, as the constant warfare for independence from King Edward I of England has left Scotland devastated. With their king ousted from his throne, the Scottish nobility were more concerned with their lands and titles rather than fighting for an independent kingdom, leading for the rise and fall in the defence of Scotland to local heroes, namely William Wallace. But Wallace's legend was shattered at Falkirk, and the only notable victory came at Roslin, but that was a Scot versus Scot rather than defeating a true English army. The only respite from the English came from the French, whom contested King Edward's holdings in Gascony. Unfortunately for the Scots, the French had signed a peace treaty with the English on the 20th of May, 1303. Any chance of support from the French was gone. King Edward was now free from any external problems and could finally focus all of his energy into conquering Scotland, and with no allies to help them, the Scots could only look to themselves for support. By the end of May 1303, Edward's army had reached the small parish town of Roxburgh, which was only 50 miles from Edinburgh, and this time, Edward's army was well supplied. Rather than relying on foraging like the last few times the English invaded, Edward was here to stay for a while to take note and stock of his new lands. The only known resistance to Edward's invasion happened at Melrose Abbey, as a small force of Scots attacked an English contingency resting there, killing most and capturing anyone of value for ransom. By July, Edward was in Perth, capturing nearby garrisons and castles. Places like Urquhart quickly fell to Edward's determination to quell his new holdings. Edward was certainly making his mark, staying in Scotland far longer than he previously had done before, and come winter, he chose to reside at Dunfermline, one of Scotland's biggest monasteries. Edward still faced a little resistance, as Wallace was being hunted by an English force under the command of Sir John Seagrave and Robert Clifford. Edward finally left Dunfermline in March 1304. After having received some homages from Scotland's nobles, Edward then organised a parliament to convene in St Andrews, with more landowners giving homage to Edward, including John Comyn, the Guardian of Scotland. As for William Wallace, he was in Edward's eyes the man who prolonged the war and cost him much. Edward wanted to make Wallace his main example of what happens to those that greatly anger him. Edward's words to Wallace were, "Let him put himself at the grace and disposal of the Lord King if that seems good to him." Basically, bend the knee. The nobility of Scotland then decreed that Wallace was an outlaw. The man that had risen up against tyranny and had fought to free his people was now condemned by his own countrymen. The hunt for Wallace was on, but there was still one last stronghold that resisted Edward, Stirling Castle. This was the area in which the English had lost decisively several years ago to Wallace, a painful memory that King Edward had to correct. Despite the castle being only garrisoned by 30 men under the command of William Oliphant, the castle stood firm and resisted King Edward's will. Perhaps these brave or foolish men, depending on your perception, wanted to either die as patriots or perhaps spark another uprising of the Scottish. Oliphant did try and buy himself some time by requesting to Edward that he would seek terms of surrender from the master of the castle, John Soles, a former guardian of Scotland. However, this was clearly a ploy for time, as Soles was in exile in France, and for news to reach him could take weeks or months. Yet King Edward rejected this proposal, and soon had 13 giant siege engines constructed with various parts coming from all over Scotland. And some even came from his new Scottish vassals, as Robert the Bruce sent at least one siege engine to assist Edward. A huge amount of wagons carried all the materials needed to construct such large siege engines. King Edward was prepared to use everything at his disposal to bring down Stirling Castle. The sources state that he used lead balls, Greek fire, and perhaps an early mixture of gunpowder to bring the walls down. Yet Stirling Castle stood strong, as the garrison could take cover in the caves underneath the castle with their supplies and wait out the bombardment. Frustrated with the lack of progress, King Edward ordered his carpenters to begin construction of an enormous trebuchet called Warwolf. This trebuchet is believed to have been the biggest one ever assembled, and the mere sight of it terrified the Scottish garrison so much that they immediately tried to surrender. However, King Edward, like most chaps with new toys, wanted to try it out and demanded that the Scottish garrison stayed in the castle until Warwolf had launched at least one projectile. Warwolf was soon put into position and fired one 140-kilogram projectile at one of the walls, bringing it down immediately. Satisfied, King Edward finally accepted the Scots' surrender. Scotland was now firmly in Edward's grasp. The only matter left was the capture of Wallace, and Edward hoped Wallace would be apprehended by a fellow Scot, and even tasked some former guardians of Scotland to give chase to Wallace. King Edward now looked to further consolidate his power over Scotland politically by having representatives elected at a parliament in Perth in order to create an administration to rule the lands in Edward's name as king. There was no mention of a Scotland or a Scottish realm, only land to be divided and passed out to others. As for Wallace, his luck finally ran out on the 3rd of August 1305, as he was indeed captured by a fellow Scot. Wallace was then dragged straight to London to face a mock trial, even being forced to wear a crown of laurel, a mock gesture to imply that Wallace wanted to wear his own crown. As Wallace had already been branded an outlaw at the St. Andrew's Parliament, no jury was set to appear, and Wallace wasn't even allowed to defend himself. All Wallace could do was stand there while a list of his crimes were read out. After the lists of crimes had been read out, Wallace responded to only one charge: that he was no traitor and he hadn't sworn an oath to King Edward, as in his words, he was a Scot of Scottish birth and owed nothing to an English king. Yet the court responded with, his own lord and king had sworn oaths to King Edward, and by that charge, so had Wallace. Wallace was soon dragged from Westminster to the Tower of London. Wallace's death was a painful one. He was hung, drawn and quartered before being cut up, and his body parts being sent to various parts of England and Scotland. But with Wallace's death, King Edward had unwittingly used Wallace as an ember that would soon spark a fire so large that a new Scotland would emerge, united under a new flag of nationalism, but that would take some time.